speaking. But let's bring in Seppi Golzari-Munro, Acting Director of the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. She joins us in Edinburgh in Scotland after a mammoth fortnight, of course, at the summit in Glasgow. Thanks very much for joining us. Sort of the day after it all ends, what's your overall sense now of how successful it was?
I think it's absolutely been a breakthrough summit, but of course, next 12 months are going to be absolutely critical to make sure that countries deliver not only on their promises to reduce their emissions and ensure that they develop those plans to reduce those emissions, but that the developed world actually does deliver the finance that's required by the developing world in order to make this transition and in order to adapt to the effects of climate change and its impacts that they're already feeling today.
And that whole question of what happened with China and India and coal, has it become any clearer as to what happened at the very end?
From what I understand, there was a huddle between the Chinese, the Indians, but also the US and the Europeans to cut this deal. And as you will have seen from the plenary afterwards, many small island nations and the developing countries were very disappointed with the watering down of the language. However, it is still the first time that fossil fuels have been mentioned in the cover text of this political agreement in over 2 decades. And some liken it to, talking about the pandemic without naming the virus, or talking about lung cancer without talking about cigarettes. It's been a case of talking about climate change without talking about its causes for about 2 decades. So it is a historic moment to mention fossil fuels. But not only that. Outside of the formal negotiations, there was a huge amount of progress to actually end international fossil fuel subsidies. So for coal, oil and gas from countries, big supporters of subsidies overseas, such as the US and Canada. So there has been movement both inside the formal negotiations and outside.
And the question of finance, loss and damage, the whole sort of funding question, if developed nations had been willing to pay more, could there have been more movement on coal and fossil fuels generally?
Possibly, because, the reality is that, the Chinese and the Indians were not happy with the text, but they were able to ally themselves with some of the developing world or take cover from the fact that the developing world was disappointed, that promises were broken to the developing world about this finance that was promised from 2020. Just to put that in context, what was promised 12 years ago now to the developing countries was $100 billion per year in climate finance. Now, that is 1/7 of the US military budget alone. And to remember, this 100 billion is to be divided amongst all developed economies. So in the context of these economies, it's actually not a huge amount. And so the disappointment from the developing world about the lack of delivery on that promise really will have held back some of the negotiating points.
How much would be needed if you try to quantify, achieving real change? What proportion of developed economies' budgets should go on this?
Well, it's not necessarily all about public finance. It's not just about grants and concessional finance from developed economies. It's also about the movement of private finance. But the reality is that private finance doesn't invest in adaptation, measures to, build a seawall to help protect a community from rising sea levels, for example. They may invest in, power plants which can deliver a return on their investment. So that's a money-making enterprise. So the reality is there has to be a balance between public and private finance. But there's been some calculations to say that what the developing world actually needs in terms of both public and private finance is roughly 10 times what's even being offered at this stage. So even what's being offered that hasn't been delivered is not nearly enough.
OK, Seppi, just stay with us for a moment. I just want to bring in a little bit more information because many experts have calculated that the Glasgow Climate Pact will not limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So what sort of increases are we likely to expect? Well, currently global temperatures are already 1.1 degrees over pre-industrial levels. If every nation actually carries out its long-term pledges, we get to 1.8 degrees. But if you look at what countries are actually doing, experts suggest the more likely outcome is 2.4 degrees. Well, Seppi Golzari-Munro from the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, staying with us just as we wait for a press conference from the British Prime Minister. Why is there that disparity in terms of what the temperature increase should be compared with, what's been pledged and what nations are actually doing?
So I think the first point to make is that we always knew that Glasgow wasn't going to deliver the pledges necessary to close the gap to 1.5. But what it was designed to do was make sure that countries are given a checkpoint every year rather than every 5 years, which was the previous agreement's stipulation, to come back actually every year to improve their pledges and their ambition and their policies. So that's a huge development in terms of closing the gap. I mean, some of the things that haven't been calculated in that 2.4 degree projection are some of the pledges that were made outside of the formal negotiating rooms earlier in the week.
Seppi, just to cut in, we're just going to cut in